Peter Turchin, hello. How's it going?
It's doing pretty well, thank you.
Good. We're very glad to have you in Politics.
Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about your book, End Times, fabulously displayed between the two of us here. Before we get into it, could you tell us who you are in your own words?
Well, I'm a scientist. I was educated as a theoretical biologist, but when I hit 40, I became a little bit bored with doing just biology, looked around for what else I could do, and that's why I decided to start a science of history, which we'll call cliodynamics, from Clio, the muse of history.
And how does that study lead you into the subject matter of this book, which obviously is, well, expressly political?
Yeah, well, I am very much interested both in how it came about that we live in this large-scale, complex societies organized as states, which are very recent in our evolutionary history. But also, I'm interested in why do these societies periodically encounter end times, periods of social and political turbulence, sometimes leading to quite dire outcomes such as collapse, but not necessarily so.
Before we get to those end times, they're often preceded by what you call ages of discord, periods of political instability that, like I said, precede the collapse of the state. We're talking in the West, we're currently in Britain, but how far along in your view do you see the Western democracies along that path, that age of discord, before we get to an end time?
Today, you mean?
Yes, today, yeah.
Well, I know the best situation I know is United States, because that's where I live and that's where I have tons of data that I have analyzed. And we certainly have started our age of discord. It became quite obvious by January 6, 2021, of course, the storming of the Capitol. But in fact, you could even date it with 2016, when Donald Trump was elected the president. And here in UK, the Brexit was clearly a very good sign that things are not going quite as well as one would hope to.
With the situation, the book focuses on the role of elites, right, in these processes. Could you talk a little bit about American history, because you sort of chart from the New Deal, right, looking forward, and the period of reducing wealth inequality as a result of that. And we lose the path a little bit, don't we, in the 70s and 80s. Could you talk us through that history, please?
In fact, I go all the way back to the beginnings of the American Republic. And the reason for that is that ever since complex societies, organized states, appeared about 5,000 years ago, we now have good data, and it shows that they experience periods of integrative periods, which are periods of internal peace and order, about maybe a century long. It varies a bit. And then followed by disintegrative periods. These are the ages of discord. And so it is essentially a macrohistorical pattern that all complex societies go through these stages. So in the United States, in fact, the previous age of discord started in 1850s. Of course, then there was very traumatic American Civil War, a little bit of a calm, but not really that calm, and then another outbreak of political instability in 1920s, which ended with the New Deal.
Could you talk, for a viewer who might not be familiar with the New Deal, could you explain what that was and the impact that it had on American society?
Yeah. So in fact, we have, because this is really a science of history, we need to get data. And one of the things we do, we quantify what does instability mean. We look at things like how frequent are violent riots when people are actually getting killed, terrorism events, really terrible things like lynchings, and so on and so forth. So if you look, if you trace the frequency of these events, you obviously see a huge peak in the 1860s and 1870s associated, even if you take the Civil War out, all right? It was still associated with a big peak of this instability. And then a huge peak in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, United States was really in a revolutionary situation, and it was very clear to the elites at that time. And so what happened was that the elites managed to avoid a civil war during that period, And we can talk a bit more about the details, what they did, and what are the drivers of instability. They managed to reverse those drivers of instability as a result of reforms they have adopted during the New Deal. So we have these two examples. The 1860s, when the American elites just completely lost the situation and had a very bloody war, 600,000 people killed, right? And then 1920s and 30s, when they did manage to sail through those turbulent waters to a fairly safe haven.
So you mentioned there the drivers of instability. Could you explain to us, in your view, what they are?
Well, the most important driver is what we call elite overproduction. This is, we see elite overproduction, essentially it is a universal sign of end times that are possible to come. So what is elite overproduction? First of all, who are the elites? Elites are simply the small proportion of the population, of the society, that concentrate social power in their hands. So think about the proverbial 1% in the United States, or the Mandarin class in Imperial China, or military nobility here in England during the medieval period. So these are the elites. The next question is how are elites recruited and reproduced? All right. Typically what happens is that there are people, elite wannabes, right? What technical term is elite aspirants, and there are typically many more elite aspirants than power positions for them to occupy. And there is some competition. But, and that's normal. Some competition is good. But periodically, societies get into situations when there are too many elite aspirants. Two times, 3 times, 4 times as many elite aspirants as positions for them to occupy. So it's like a game of musical chairs, except you're not removing musical chairs, right? What you're doing, you're increasing the number of players. You can imagine the chaos that ensues. And that's typically what happens, because this extreme competition leads to intra-elite conflicts, and because elites are key to proper functioning of our complex societies, once they become dysfunctional, that's when all kinds of hell can be broken loose.
Could you explain also, in the book, the term you use is the wealth pump. Could you explain its role in and how it relates to elites?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because the wealth pump explains why do we get elite overproduction sometimes and not at other times. Let me start by saying that, remember that I said that societies go through integrative phases and disintegrative phases. Well, typically in the middle of integrative phase, the elites get so used that things are working well, you know, and typically at that point it's working well for the population as well. But the elites become turning more selfish, because they are tempted to use their power to reconfigure the economy in such a way that the fruits of economy flow disproportionately towards themselves. And that is really what the wealth pump is. It's a perverse mechanism that pumps wealth and income from workers or peasants, whichever period we're talking about, to the elites. All right, so why is this bad? First of all, and obviously, the living standards of the majority of the population decline. And that leads to a lot of discontent, and it creates, increases their mass mobilization potential, essentially. All right, so that's the obvious thing. Less obvious is the effect on the elites themselves. So at first, everything is peachy for them. You know, they experience a great golden age. They're getting wealthier, but then there's also more of them. There's upward social mobility, and so the society, maybe in a generation or two, becomes very top-heavy. Lots of elites, and they consume a lot, and there really are there are too many of them for the rest of the society, and that's how we get elite overproduction, and that eventually leads to the situation where a large swath of the elite aspirants get frustrated because they don't get the positions, and some of them decide to break the rules of the game. So think about, for example, this is what happened in the United States quite recently. We had this wealth pump was turned on during 1970s. Prior to that, the worker salaries and the wages have been growing together with the economy. And then suddenly they stopped growing, economy grew, and all of that extra wealth, this is how the wealth pump operated, right? It went to the economic elites. And suddenly, over a period of, like, say, 40 years, from 1970s to, roughly speaking, 2010, we had an explosion of the numbers of uber wealthy. So, for example, people, households with $10 million or more, or decamillionaires, right? Their numbers increased tenfold during this period, tenfold. The population grew 40%, the numbers of them increased tenfold, all right? So, and some of those wealthy people wanted to translate their wealth into political office. Donald Trump, of course, is a great example, but not the only one. Michael Bloomberg is another example, and many others. And so what happened was lots of these wealthy people flooded the pipeline leading to political office. Their competition increased. You can see that because they've been spending lots of money, and the cost of campaign has just exploded. And then at some point, there were so many of them that some of them decided to break the rules. And we saw that very clearly in the elections of 2016. So here is a specific example how the wealth pump and elite overproduction undermine the stability of societies.
Some people will hear that point and argue that the extractive characteristics that you're describing are a defining characteristic of capitalism. They'll say that the capitalist system extracts wealth from the poor and redistributes it towards the rich. How much have you found in your research that actually this takes place across economic systems, across socio-political systems, that actually the answer isn't simply capitalism, it runs deeper than that?
Yeah, exactly. So in medieval times, for example, the lords would often extract wealth from peasants using coercive means, basically turning them into serfs or even slaves in ancient societies. And in capitalist times, it is maybe less violent, but still using the laws of supply and demand. As the labor supply increases, right, the price of, compared to demand, the price of labor falls. And so the economic elites can manipulate that. But it's not true that capitalist societies are always extractive. As I said, the societies typically go through these cycles. They're not perfect cycles, but they are essentially boom and bust types of dynamics. And sometimes the capitalists and workers coexist in good balance. So here in UK, for example, after the Chartist period, which adopted a set of necessary reforms, the workers' salaries started to grow together with the economy, which was growing quite well because of the Industrial Revolution and so on and so forth. So for about a century, from 1850, the system was in good balance.
So I think one of the central questions of the book is about social power and obviously elites. You mentioned earlier sort of decamillionaires being an example of elites, but obviously not everyone has more than £10 million and other people can still occupy those positions and be termed elites. So would you be able to talk a little bit more about who in your eyes in modern society constitutes an elite, and ideally as well sort of with a British perspective would be really helpful?
Sure. So in modern democratic societies, modern democratic capitalist societies, the ruling class typically is a coalition between economic elites, wealth holders, and credentialed elites who become politicians, typically. So credentialed elites here in UK, for example, if you want to become prime minister, what do? You go to Oxford, right? In the United States, if you want to become president, there are two routes. One of them is you have a lot of wealth, either inherited or gained. The second route is the credential route, and there you get a law degree. And the best school, it turns out, is Yale Law School. That's the one which contributed the most elites, but also counter-elites. We'll talk about counter-elites in a minute. So in different countries, the balance between those two segments of the elites varies. Like in France, for example, it's mostly the credential route. You have to go to one of the grandes écoles to become a leader in both economy and politics. All right. In UK, it's sort of in between.
I mean, particularly as well in the case of the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who, being an educated man, a successful business person, but also extraordinarily personally wealthy as well. Is he kind of an example of perhaps a combination
Both.
of the two?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned counter-elites then, so could you explain what you mean by that term, please?
Yeah, well, counter-elites, think about people like Lenin's Bolsheviks, you know, Castro's Barbudos, all right? And now let's go back to the United States. Maybe it would be startling to think about the newly wealthy capitalists in the North and Northwest during the middle of the 19th century as counter-elites. But that's exactly what it was. So what happened was that the United States was ruled by antebellum ruling class, which was mainly slave owners in coalition with some northeastern merchants, all right? And then what happened was, as a result of industrialization and also the wealth pump got turned on because there was movement of potential workers from the rural areas, which became overpopulated, to the cities, and also, of course, massive immigration from outside. That wealth created huge numbers of new millionaires. All right. Again, it was more than tenfold increase in the number of millionaires during this period of time. And they were mostly located in the north. They made their money by mining, railroads, you know, manufacturing, things like that. And they were chafing under the rule of the southern elites. And essentially what 1860s was another revolution where one set of counter-elites, and of course their main political leader was Abraham Lincoln, all right, they essentially overthrew and destroyed the southern elites as class.
Because of the connections between wealth, elites, and political power, do you think it's possible for democracy to ever sort of free itself from the risks of plutocracy and private capital interests?
Well, we have not been able to do that so far. And I would certainly not assume that democracy will automatically solve our problems. Because we see we are getting into, both in the US and UK, we are clearly getting into these end times. Right, so other examples of end times that we should really be worried about are things like, you know, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, or the Civil War, the English Civil War in the 17th century. Because end times have the potential of being really leading to very bloody events, as a result of which, like in French Revolution and Russian Revolution, the ancien regime, nobility, was essentially destroyed. So this is something that we need to worry about. And back in the middle 19th century, America was a decent democracy. Of course, there were lots of, it was not a modern democracy, but you know, there was a large proportion of white males voted, all right? And still they could not avoid their own, you know, very disruptive end to their end times.
How do you answer the criticism, you know, listening to what you said there, it's very striking to describe what's happening in Britain and America right now as comparable potentially to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, you know, mass upheaval, collapse of the state, bloody revolution. And people might say, yeah, look, okay, you know, we had COVID and that was deeply unpleasant. Brexit, not a great decision, but you know, at the end of the day, there hasn't been a violent collapse of the state. Things aren't great. I'd like my country to be better. But it really doesn't seem like we're building a guillotine in Parliament Square. How do you answer the criticism that this is quite an alarmist thing to say? Yeah,
I know, and I agree it's an alarmist thing to say. And in fact, it is hard for me to imagine a revolution in America, for example, similar to a French Revolution. However, if you look at what happened during those ages of discord preceding the violent ruptures, that's how ancien nobility, ancien regime nobility thought. They couldn't imagine that by taking actions that they did, it would lead to them being guillotined. Same in Russia, same in antebellum America. It's because people get so used, especially, and elites too, so get so used that the country is functioning maybe not greatly right now. There's a lot of signs of social dysfunction we see on both sides of the Atlantic. But people get so used to to the last 2-3 generations when things worked without spinning into a death spiral, right? That they assume it would go like this. This time is different, right? This is the argument that people would say. And it turns out later on, this time was not different. So also, I'm not saying that you have 100% probability of this thing. Here's where science of history is very helpful, because we have been building a database of historical societies sliding into the crisis and then coming out of it. So we are close to 200 such cases, and we are building more. And so what we find by analyzing these previous cases is that the road to crisis seems to be quite channelized. It's like a valley with high walls, and the ball is rolling. There's only one way for it to roll. But then when it gets to the crisis, it's like a cusp, and a bunch of different roads opens up. Some of them lead to collapse. Others, in some small proportion of cases, the elites and population manage to pull together and resolve things. All right, so examples are like the Chartist period, which is middle 19th century here in the UK, the Progressive era and New Deal that we have mentioned already, or in Russia, for example, the Reform period of 1860s, which postponed the revolution by 50 years. So it is possible. We can really classify the different types of outcomes, all right? And so that means that a violent revolution and civil war is not inevitable. Humans have the agency to resolve it. And one other thing to add is that as we go back in the past, we see that the frequency of dire outcomes, collapses, is more frequent than as you approach the present. And it looks like that as our societies have accumulated better governing institutions, including, for example, democratic institutions, or also as our economies have become more productive as a result of capitalism, that seems to decrease the probability of really violent outcomes, and also shortens the periods of violent civil wars. All right, so that gives us hope. But again, let me state it again, that it's not going to happen automatically. There has to be concerted collective action that would lead us to a better outcome.
You write that one of the key contributing factors to elite overproduction, and therefore leading to instability and as a threat to democracy, is the proliferation of advanced degrees for young people. It seems almost counterintuitive to me to suggest that having a better educated population leads to a more dangerous political situation. Could you explain your thinking there?
Well, I'm an academic, and so...
You're the threat, Peter.
Well, we can talk about that, the overproduction of PhDs, for example. But what I want to say is that I have taught, just retired a year ago, I've taught at a very good research university in the United States. But in my estimation, at most 15% of my students really care about education. The rest of them are in there for credentials. So what we need to do, education is, I think, undiluted good. But what I'm talking about is the credentials. So as we get lots of people with credentials competing for a not rapidly changing number of positions, right, that's when we get elite overproduction. So for example, in the revolutions of 1848 in continental Europe, they had this huge bulge of youth with advanced credentials. More recently, if you look at the Egyptian revolution, before the revolution, maybe 10-15 years before the revolution, the Mubarak regime increased the number of university students by a factor of 4, all right? And so at Tahrir Square during which drove the fall of the Mubarak regime, it was primarily this overproduced youth with degrees that they could not use anymore, who were very angry, and they were the driving force that actually brought the regime down.
My final question to you, Peter, but it is a very broad one. You've written this book because you want to learn the lessons of history, how we can avoid these violent upheavals. So, you've done the work. Looking back, what are the lessons that we can learn? How do we avoid ending up in that situation where the ball is travelling down the valley with the walls on either side and we're trapped with the certainty of revolution? How do we stop it from happening?
Well, first of all, it's possible to do that. So if you go back to the Chartist period, right, before the middle of the 19th century, the workers' salaries wages were decreasing despite the economy growing very rapidly. All right, but what the elites, the British elites, managed to do was to first and foremost, they shut down the wealth pump. They did that by giving more power to workers, for example, right? And also abolishing the Corn Laws, which was a very good way to pump wealth from peasants, from workers to lords, essentially. So similar type of situation happened during the New Deal. So we don't have to use exactly the same mixture of things. Like in the, as a result of the New Deal and then World War II, United States, the elites in the United States agreed to be taxed at a really high rate, 90%. If you earn $1 million or more, then the state would take 90% of that. It seems unthinkable, right? And I'm not saying that this is what you have to do right now, although I think probably we need to increase the taxes in the states. But what we need to do is to learn from history, not directly by using analogy. It's too vulnerable to cherry picking and things like that. This is where we need the science of history. We need to perfect our models of how societies work. We're not there yet. I don't want to say that we now know everything. We know enough that we need to shut down the wealth pump. But precisely how we do that, societies are complex systems with many interacting parts. So you cannot just say that, okay, we do this and expect a linear outcome of it, because you can get beat by unintended consequences. So this is where we need to approach this as an engineering problem, right? If you want to build a bridge, you don't just do it by the seat of your pants. And the same thing, we don't want to reform our societies by the seat of our pants.
Could you point to a society perhaps that you think has a higher degree of political stability where we could draw those lessons? Again, not to be completely analogous and just copy what they're doing, but perhaps a good example of someone who's in a less dangerous situation than perhaps America or Britain is?
Well, at this point, because in previous examples, in the previous crisis that we studied, there was not really a good understanding why societies got into this problem. So in the small proportion of positive cases, people in some elite prosocial segments of the elites intuitively understood what the problem is. But I can give you a historical example. If we compare societies that have monogamous elites, all right, so only one wife is allowed, right? Yeah. And of course, it was little hanky-panky, there are always mistresses and things like that. Still, it's different from societies with massively polygamous elites, like many Islamic societies or the Great Steppe society, so on and so forth. It turns out that societies with polygamous elites are much, much more prone to end times. They come much faster because they overproduce elites very rapidly, Genghis Khan had 100 sons, all right? So very rapidly you have too many elites. And so this is one of the reasons, in fact, why monogamy spread. Places like Japan or even Turkey, Turkey is an Islamic country, but there is a law that there is only one wife is allowed. And monogamy spread as a result of this cultural evolution process, where the societies that were less, functional, they imitated societies which were more functional. And monogamy is associated with a suite of better characteristics, less crime, and all kinds of things. And so, as a result of that, societies learn from others, all right? And that's why monogamy is now mostly the rule, not everywhere, but in the majority of the world. So we need to essentially now, going in the future, we need also to let this type of cultural evolution, imitation of success, essentially, to get engaged and learn what are the better ways of organizing societies and what ways lead to dysfunctional outcomes.
It's quite interesting to hear you say that, because obviously one of the key political talking points at the moment is ageing demographics and ageing societies, and whether or not we're actually reproducing enough to have a workforce that can support the welfare state. Peter Turchin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it. End Times, yeah, it's a great book. I'd encourage everyone to read it. Thank you.
Thank you.